Thanks for joining. Thanks for joining. If you've just joined, if you could mute, please, that would be great. Just to cut out any background noise. Just bring Adrian in and Michael Bromwich. Morning, Michael. Morning, Adrian. Thanks for joining. Morning. Thanks for joining. More people joining. Morning, Georgina. Thanks for joining. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, it's now 10:32. We are recording, so first of all, big thumbs up. Everybody's happy to be recorded. Derek, John's gone. Michael, thumbs up. I'll monitor the lobby. Take great delight in welcoming you to Tom McPhail, in conversation with Tom McPhail. Today's session should be really interesting. Let me just mute there. Sorry, Joshua, I'm going to mute you. There we go. We are being recorded, as we know. If you want to raise a hand and ask, challenge, agree with, or not agree with Tom, then please raise a hand. We will also open up the chat room. And I hope you enjoy the session. And Tom, in advance, thank you very much indeed for your time. I know you are mega busy. We've got a new government, so why don't we start on this sort of first item on the agenda? Yeah, over to you on your thoughts on, the government. Let me put it that way, and things that are going to be happening there.
Well, okay, so I'm going to start with a disclaimer, and I'm going to apologise for this in advance. I'm not wholly ideologically aligned with the new government, so I just want to put that one out there up front, and I'm going to try and, as far as possible, be objective. But my starting point on this is they seem quite determined not to get re-elected for a second term. I thought the budget. Let's just start with the budget. I thought that was super interesting. We can park the question of whether they misled the electorate over the manifesto or not. People will make up their own minds on the NI increase, and it is what it is. I was struck in the budget by the scale of the additional taxation and spending. Extra 40 billion of taxes, extra 70 billion pounds of spending. That's not nothing. And their narrative of we need to fix the foundations and then the state of the economy. I get that. Steve and I were just talking before we came on this call about some of the dysfunctions and challenges in the NHS. But what surprised me is, and we saw this with the early pay settlements of public sector workers, was that they've announced, I think, around another 20 billion pounds they're going to throw at the NHS. They've announced all these spending commitments, and then they're going to come along afterwards and negotiate the productivity improvements, which to me sounds quite ambitious. To just give away your all your negotiating position up front and then to try and extract promises in return afterwards. So there's that. I was shocked by the OBR and the IFS assessment of the impact on economic growth. And we heard Keir Starmer this morning, is now in Baku for COP, saying that basically they've now distilled the government's purpose down to two things, which is economic growth and immigration. Everything I saw in the budget, and we might talk a bit about energy policy, on which I'm not an expert, but which I take a keen interest in. Everything I see at the moment in the budget is not going to deliver economic growth, and in particular when you look at the government's energy policy, it's going to deliver the opposite of economic growth. We're currently dismantling British industry, and we might talk a bit about Donald Trump as well and what the implications there are for ESG. So I did a podcast with the Times the day after the budget, and I was asked to sum it up in one word, and my word was gamble, and it still feels like a gamble. They're going for a sugar rush on the economy over the next 2 years. They're pumping quite a lot of money into the system. It's predicated on an assumption that they're going to get those tax revenues. From the employers I've already spoken to, and from what I've seen in terms of press commentary, and maybe people are just trying to push a narrative, but it's not at all clear they're going to get the tax revenues they're hoping for. It will have an impact on jobs. It will have an impact on incomes. None of this looks good to me. So I saw the result of the election back in July, and I wish the government well. I want this government to succeed. I want us to enjoy greater prosperity. I want their policies to work. At the moment, pretty much everything I'm looking at leads me to the opposite conclusion, that this is not good. I think they're going to strangle economic growth. I think things like the private schools policy, the VAT, and what they've done to farmers. I live next door to a farmer. I live in a farming community. I understand the value of the connection these people have with the land and the rocks and the soil and their livestock. And this government seems determined to dismantle that. And I was horrified to listen to John McTernan, who was an advisor in the Blair government, who I've always kind of liked and had respect for. Sorry, Patrick, I'll just finish this point and then we'll come to you. John McTernan literally saying, and he's not in the government anymore, but he's someone I've always admired and respected, but he's perhaps close to Labour thinking, essentially saying that he would be happy for this government to do to the farmers what Margaret Thatcher did to the miners. And I find that astonishing, that we would happily dismantle British farming. And I'm not saying the countryside works perfectly, but it's really, really important. And so there's some ideological stuff going on as well that I feel deeply uncomfortable. Anyway, yeah, Patrick, what are your thoughts? Sorry.
Well, if we could just touch on the farmers, it's an interesting point. I mean, I think they're playing a long game there, because it's interesting that so many people are fixated on this, when for the last 3 generations people haven't given a shit about the farmers. It's largely been a protected industry since the Second World War. We were protecting them from the CAP as well when we were in the EU. Yet suddenly they've brought this threshold down, which is far too low, but I think it's simply leverage for when they want to renegotiate the deal they've got with farming as an industry. So I think it's relatively small. I mean, it's quite emotive what people use about farming, but we haven't cared about farming for generations, ever since the supermarkets came into our high streets, because all they've done is shaft farming left, right, and centre and been allowed to do it.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with any of that.
Very well, spinning all the emotive stuff, but brass tacks, I don't think it's going to make that much difference to the economy, what they're doing with farming. So
yeah, and this no, that's a fair point. And I know in the big picture, it's not a big thing, and farming is not a big contributor to the economy. I think food security is more where I'm concerned. And there's bizarre stuff going on. We export a huge amount of our sheep produce, mainly to France, but also to Belgium and to Europe. We import a lot of lamb and mutton from New Zealand. What the hell's going on there? It's marginally economically viable. And you go up onto the fells around here, and there's pretty low density sheep farming. I mean, there's a lot of land that is not hugely productive. So I'm not saying there are, and I think species diversity and wilding and so on, there's a conversation to be had around a lot of that kind of stuff as well. So I'm not here to say leave our farming alone as such, but I think that particular aspect of the budget, I think, has gone down extraordinarily badly in the farming community. And you're right, the supermarkets have been putting their foot on farmers' necks for decades as well. So there's all of that. I'm also, and I want to come back to this further down the line in this conversation, but I'm also slightly horrified by the way they're spitting out quangos like a dog spitting out puppies. It's just, this is an aspect of the state architecture and the accountability of the way the state is run and how it's accountable to the public that, again, worries me deeply. We've got something like 425 different governmental bodies of one kind or another. You've got the government departments, and they're answerable to the ministers and the secretaries of state. But you've got all these multitude of quangos and non-departmental bodies as well. I did a review of one of them a couple of years ago, so I've got a little bit of insight into that. But I'm just slightly worried the way they're spitting them out now. The Ethics and Integrity Commission, the football regulator, the Regulatory Innovation Office, and so on and so forth. And I'm worried about what that's going to do to public spending. And I come back to the point about productivity and efficiency. The fundamental problem that we have, I think, is that we're just not efficient and we're not productive. And I've been reading Why Nations Fail by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson. And I heartily recommend that piece of work to anybody. It's an extraordinary analysis of how states either prosper or fail, and the extractive nature of politics and the economy. And I worry about the way we seem to be layering more and more bureaucracy into the economy rather than driving a more efficient economy. And I may be doing the government a huge disservice, but as we sit here in November after an election in July and a budget a couple of weeks ago, I don't see much grounds for optimism in terms of that big picture. The reason for my comment at the beginning about being a one-term government, I was just reflecting on how Jeremy Corbyn was an obscure backbench MP in sort of 2014-15 and suddenly ended up as leader of the Labour Party and gave Theresa May a pretty good run for her money in 2017 and has since disappeared to obscurity and isn't even a member of the Labour Party anymore, all within a few years. Boris went from an 80-seat majority in 2019 to being defenestrated just 2.5 years later. And Donald Trump over on the other side of the channel has just executed maybe a bit of hyperbole on his part, but what was undoubtedly a remarkable political comeback. The electorate, both here and abroad, seems a lot more volatile than has been the case in the past, a lot less reliable. We've got insurgent parties. The Liberal Democrats they're not an insurgent party, but they did extremely well at the election. Reform, hoovering up as many votes as the Liberal Democrats. So I think politically we're in quite a volatile time. And I think the pressure on the government to deliver and to deliver rapidly is extremely high. So I come back to the earlier point. If their policies are not delivering low inflation, economic growth, a sense of prosperity, a sense of purpose and direction in 4 years' time, I think they might find themselves in a lot of trouble. Anyway, that's all kind of, none of this is pensions. So that's all kind of high level politics, but I'll just pause there.
Yeah, Tom.
Well, thanks, Tom. Yeah,
that's good. Go on, Henry. Go on.
So I was just going to sort of make a point about some of the things you're talking about, is that most of the victims, if you like, we've classified thus far on the budget, both in terms of the farmers and the pension people, are making a strong case. But I'm hearing very much more of a case coming through from corporates, BT, for instance, announcing that it's going to cost them £100 million a year to take on these national insurance changes. Others saying that these changes are existential. I know small businesses which don't fall within the small business exemptions who are going to have to severely curtail their growth aspirations to meet their wage bills. Those organisations for whom 2.5% on payroll means pretty well a reduction in profitability of maybe 5 or 6 times that. Do you see what I mean? So I'm just wondering whether the budget is really about inheritance tax, but more that it's about taxing the profitability of companies to invest in the future and, from our point of view, in pensions. So that was my question.
Yeah, well, no, I agree with all of that, and this is part of my concern around this budget. And we disappeared down a bit of a rabbit hole on the farmers, which is, so I apologise for that. But so Rachel Reeves is planning to raise whatever it is, 25 billion from the NI increase. I'm not at all sure she'll get that. She's left herself very little headroom in the budget. There's already concerns about inflation ticking up, interest rates ticking up. We've got Trump talking about a trade war, and Rachel Reeves has very little wriggle room in the budget. So it's entirely possible a year or two from now she's going to have to come back and ask for more, and you get onto a downward spiral. And yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Henry. It's largely the private sector, it's employers, it's entrepreneurs. Look, when I joined Hargreaves Lansdown in 2002, it was a smallish private company employing a couple of hundred people, and it grew to be a FTSE 100 business worth over £10 billion and employing 1,500 people. It's businesses that create prosperity, that pay the taxes, that create the jobs. And I think your point is extremely valid, that the company I work for now employs 25 people. It's a small business. It started with one guy on his own in Edinburgh, and it's grown slowly and steadily. He's going to feel the squeeze from this NI increase. So what's that going to do for jobs and growth and prosperity and spending? Yeah, none of this looks like a formula for economic growth to me. So,
Yep. Tom, so do you want to move on to, I mean, you touched upon the US election and the US. Obviously, the markets
yeah,
are Trump gliding up the markets on the Trump win. What do you think about the US short and longer term?
well, I've got a couple of thoughts on that, and we'll come back to the pensions in the budget because I think there's some specific points there that are worth digging into. Um, Look, I didn't know which way it was going to go. I don't think anybody did. Turns out it was, pretty comfortable win in the end. I guess it was a repudiation for identity politics, for the messaging of the Democrats, for Kamala Harris. It was an endorsement of Trump. Look, he's got a clean sweep, right? This was no narrow win. So I think the particular, and I come back to that point about the volatility of electorates and all of this, that you definitely can't take them for granted anymore. I think one of the things that really interests me coming out of that is the implications for, and I've mentioned already, Starmer being in Baku, is for ESG, for environmentalism, for the net zero strategy. We've got countries from Brazil and Guatemala to Norway to Azerbaijan, India, all doubling down on hydrocarbons, Russia. And in the meantime, Europe and in particular the UK are steadfastly heading in the other direction. And we've got announcements on, a ban on domestic gas boilers within a couple of years. Well, I've built a house. I've built an energy efficient house in which we had a heat exchange, heat pump, right? But you've got to make that really airtight to make that work. We had to go back again and again and get the builders to insulate the place better to make the whole thing stand up and work efficiently. Currently, British houses are not built to a standard that will make heat pumps a viable heating option. So that's going to be an interesting challenge. But at the moment, the government is heading steadfastly in that direction, and I worry about the deindustrialization of this country. And we don't need to build everything here. We don't build microchips here. But the loss of our steel industry, I think, is kind of worrying. So at the moment, this government is doubling down on ESG. And I think one of the consequences of the Trump victory is that there may just be a bit of a global rethink on all of that. And I'm interested I don't know, but I'll be interested to see what implications that has for trustees, for investment managers, for retail investors, in terms of how they drive their investment strategy in what feels to me right now to be a bit of an inflection point in the global narrative. It just feels like the Overton window has shifted quite significantly in the last month. It was, I think, shifting already. Personally, I mean, again, maybe I'm just kind of, it's confirmation bias, but I question whether, look what they've done to the car industry in the UK with this accelerating imposition of, you've got to sell more and more electric vehicles, and if you sell internal combustion engine vehicles, you get fined for it. It's causing misery to our motor industry. So and like I said, maybe it's confirmation bias, but it feels to me like the whole net zero thing is about to run out of steam, and I think that has some interesting implications for the whole pensions industry. So that was one of my big takeaways from the US election, and I don't know the consequences of that, but I think it'll be interesting to watch it play through. The tariffs thing worries me. I listened to the Joe Rogan interview when Trump said his favorite word in the English language was tariffs. Okay, and you don't understand how that's going to drive up US inflation. You really want a trade war? Well, I was listening to someone else saying, yeah, but the thing about Trump is what he'll do is if you owe him $1 million, he'll come along and he'll say, look, I'll give you $300,000 and it will cost you more than $1 million to sue me. So take the money and be happy with that. And that's how he operates. And that sounded like a pretty plausible anecdote. So maybe he's not going to be as bullish on trade wars as so apparently, do you want to explain that? Tariffs won't be inflationary? Go and explain that one to us, please.
Oh, Podrick's made a comment. So, Podrick, do you want to comment on that
Yes,
yourself?
but Trump said no. Trump said that in his acceptance speech. He said it was his favourite word. It's a beautiful word,
Beautiful
and that
word.
his tariffs
Beautiful.
won't be inflationary, which is nonsense.
Well, I think so. I mean, I'm not an
It is nonsense
economist, but
because as soon as he said that, every government, if there's going to be tariffs, every single government's going to find their cost of borrowing going up. So I mean, how does that not inflationary? I don't
well,
know.
I agree, which is not great news for Rachel Reeves. Rosalind.
You're on mute, Rosalind.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just incompetent with the internet. Yeah, I was just going to say, the thing I really don't understand, is why the markets have been excited about Trump. I get the idea of markets being excited about having a bit more certainty, but I think all this dreaming idea that, oh, he probably doesn't mean it, I absolutely means it. Whether he can do it competently, I don't know. I think he can do it a lot more effectively than he did it last time, because there are fewer people who are going to, refuse to follow the order to shoot peaceful unarmed protesters in the legs, etc. I mean, I take issue with the idea that actually that it's a backlash against the wokeism that the left was putting out there. I don't think they did at all. I think they moved to the right, and what Trump did was weaponize an anti-woke position and say these guys may not be saying it, but they're all woke, you know. I think that if you look at it, that seems to be what's happened. But that aside, the thing I really don't understand, and this is me being very dim, is I don't understand why markets are in the US seem to be embracing what to me sounds like a period of incredible uncertainty and a bunch of insane politics, like I'm going to, it's not I'm going to reduce inflation, I'm going to reduce prices, I'm going to have deflation and tariffs, and that's going to happen somehow. That's what he was elected on. So I just don't understand why economically competent people in the stock markets are going, oh, that sounds good.
Well, no, I'm not sure I can entirely explain it either. I think there's a couple of things there. One is drill, baby, drill, right? So I think his energy policy, which is not great for the national parks of the United States, but will perhaps stimulate the US economy. So that's maybe part of it, is because he's going to double down on the hydrocarbons, and that will stimulate the economy. So that may be part of it. The bit that worries me as well is he's a populist, right? I mean, I don't think I'm doing him a disservice in saying that. So he's going to spend more money, right? He's going to borrow more money and he's going to spend more money. And he's talked about reducing the deficit. I can't see that happening, right? So for now, at least the US enjoys the luxury of being the global reserve currency. How far are they going to push that? So, I mean, to your point, Rosalind, I think there's a lot going on with US economic policy, but that spending aspect of it and the borrowing aspect of it, that worries me as well. That we could end up again. So look, we're into an inflationary spiral again there, and so I guess maybe the markets have it feels like kind of a short-term reaction. I think maybe longer terms. Sorry, Kevin, I'm just reading your comment there. I couldn't see that. Yeah, maybe they're happy it was a landslide. I mean, the fact that he's got control of Congress, and a fair slice of the legal system, whether you like it or not, at least he can do stuff. So whether what he does is good or not, at least he can do stuff. So there's that. So I mean, obviously we'll hear pretty shortly what happens on the foreign policy stuff, and particularly Ukraine and the Middle East. I guess maybe peace in Central Europe, however it's achieved. Back to your point, Rosalind, that may go down well unless you're Ukrainian, perhaps. So there's that. But look, I'm no expert on the US. I'm not an expert on anything really. But I mean, I just think there's a couple of aspects there that are going to be interesting from a domestic point of view, and I think particularly the net zero and the ESG aspect of US policy is going to present a real challenge for Starmer and Miliband, and personally, I'm not unhappy about that. I want to come back to the two the pension stuff that was in the budget. Obviously, we all went, well, let's double down on the salary sacrifice schemes now because it's even more worth it than it was before, because you actually circumvent an even higher level of employer NI. And if you're fortunate enough to benefit from an employer that gives you all the NI back again, then it's fantastic. You know, you can double your money relative to what your net pay would have been if you do salary sacrifice. I wonder whether next year, I'm surprised you didn't do it this time, whether Rachel Reeves will be back to come up with some mechanism to ban salary sacrifice, which I know is hard to do, but surely it's going to be in their thinking, because any employers who aren't doing salary sacrifice surely must do it now in light of those NI changes coming in from the next tax year. So, but for now, you know, fill your boots. So there was that, and I just want to touch also on the IHT on pensions bit of it, which I find really interesting. And like Billy, my immediate thought was, well, surely that's going to stimulate greater interest in annuity sales. I think, you know, and I still don't fully understand how this is going to play through. I'd really love to sit down with a handful of financial advisors and just kick it around the room. I think one thing is that age 75 has become a more significant inflection point now for your financial planning. Post 75, you're looking at double taxation, possibly really very onerous double taxation, because your pension pots are going to be subject to both IHT and income tax, so possibly up to 64%. So that's not great. Or 67, I think, if you're a 45% taxpayer when you draw the money out. So I think that will change people's behavior. Presumably, it'll mean money flowing out of pensions faster. And surely this is going to drive people with larger pension pots to do more gifts out of income in their lifetime as a way of getting the money out of their pension. Yes, I'll pay income tax on it, but if I then gift it out of income, it's immediately exempt for IHT purposes, so I can start cascading the money down through the generations, and then I've just got to make sure I live long enough to make that really effective. But an annuity might be a good way of doing that. So I think also, if I were in my 40s or 50s and I was at that point of trying to accelerate my pension funding, if I were a wealthy individual, the kind of people who might have been looking at the removal of the lifetime allowance recently and going, well, let's fill our boots, you know, build up lots of money in a tax exempt pension pot, even if the tax-free cash tops out at 268,000, it's still worth having money in my pension fund. But now it's potentially going to be liable to double taxation and at least either income tax or IHT. So I think we might see a bit less money flowing into pensions from those wealthier individuals in later life, the ones who would have been throwing in tens of thousands of pounds into their pension pots in middle and later life. You know, why would you keep doing that now? Surely those individuals are going to look for other investment vehicles for their savings. And I'm not sure how all this exactly plays through, but I'd welcome any thoughts from anyone on this call who's got anything more to add to that. But I think from a financial planning point of view, it does fundamentally shift how people will approach their financial planning in later life.
Yeah, I wonder whether John Mather or Kevin Hollister has something to say about that. John or Kevin, do you want to make a point on that particular point? Or Kevin, you put a note in the chat, but Kevin, do you want to go first? Just unmute.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've looked at kind of longevity pooling in various ways, and one of the routes, I mean, in the kind of simplest route, what you could effectively do is if that, you're giving up the right to pass on your remaining pot to your dependents or your spouse or whatever, and you're leaving that pot for effectively the residual members of the fund. I haven't really kind of thought this through, but does putting IHT on that then cause an issue? Because what you'd leave, I don't know, would there be tax implications of what you left to the remaining people in the fund, and therefore would it potentially harm some of the suggested ways people are talking about longevity pooling?
I would have thought not, if it's not a discretionary distribution. If it's just going into the pool of beneficiaries. I mean, I don't know.
I think you've got another problem. You get the Mansion House speech trying to get us involved in infrastructure and long-term investments. And then we get this situation where you're going to have to, on an untimely death after 75, invested in illiquid, they're going to have to actually take a haircut on selling that illiquid. So the tax rate goes way beyond 80% on that, way beyond. So in fact, what's going to happen is people will not be investing in anything that's illiquid or long-term. So the country will not benefit from robbing pension funds in future and stuffing rubbish into them. So, you know, in my own case, I deferred my pension. And in fact, I put 87 when I'll draw it. But that gives me, or my spouse, beyond my spouse, a huge tax charge of over 80%. So what will I do? I'm not going to pay 6-figure, 7-figure taxes. It's just a tax on prudence. So people are going to stop having any faith in pensions at all. If you get robbed regularly by pensions legislation, why would you bother? You're trapped in a pension. You can't move. You get a Pensions Act every 7 years, changing the rules on you. So how the hell do you do long-term planning? You just can't. It's a nonsense. It's just there.
So, and I think that's a really interesting point, John. And just before you come in, Henry, the point I was going to make, and I think this sort of relates a bit to the Mansion House, is I don't think this. There's been a lot of interesting stuff going on from the previous government and then the current government on things like scheme consolidation and sweeping up the small pots and driving the investment strategy. And what I don't think they've done yet, and I think they do still need to do, is articulate a coherent vision of what they see the UK pension system evolving into over, say, the next 5 or 10 years, or even 20 years, if you're being more ambitious. But, you know, there's lots of interesting stuff going on, but none of it coalesces into a coherent picture of this is, if not an end state, this is a path they're trying to take us on. I don't see them articulating that at the moment. And I think the intersection of private savings with the state pension, with the housing market, you know, it doesn't feel like they're doing the intellectual heavy lifting on that at the moment. Anyway, sorry, look, Henry.
You're on mute, Henry.
It's amazing what he's got to say.
Sorry, I am finally off mute. Yeah, I think there's a mass market issue here, and that is that most of the tax relief goes towards the wealthy, and the wealthy are not going to get much sympathy from Rachel Reeves or a Labour government. So if the big picture, which is yet to emerge, which will probably come out of these current reviews, which they're doing, is that they want to reform the pensions market, I think they'll say, wealth be damned. What we really want is a mass market pension system for the second pillar, which actually is much more orientated around adequacy and over the long term protects people against living too long, rather than a system which protects people from IHT, which seems to be the primary concern of the wealth market. Slightly contentious in this environment, but there are considerably more people in the mass market who don't have a consideration about IHT than in the wealth market who do.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I'll come to you in a second, John, but I'm personally, you know, I see no reason why pensions should enjoy some special exemption from IHT. So I was quite relaxed about them changing the rules on IHT. I'm not a big fan of IHT full stop, but I think I'm quite relaxed with there being parity across the systems. I think what George Osborne did in the autumn of 2014 when he announced this tax-free or largely tax-free treatment of pensions was not a good policy at the time. But yeah, John.
Well, it's retrospective legislation, which is never fair. And how on earth can somebody on a 40th uplifted benefit scheme actually understand pensions at all? As soon as we take all the people who have this free load where the risk is covered by the taxpayer, they're the people who are actually ripping the pensions business off. You know, I used to have Dennis Healy and Roy Jenkins as clients. When you get uplifted 40ths for 1 day of service, and that's worth around about 6 or 7 million, and we've had inflation since then. How on earth can you actually believe these people? These turkeys are not going to vote for Christmas, though, are they? So they keep on penalising the prudent, and it's the prudent who actually decide to provide pensions for their staff. You deny the boss any benefits, he's not going to actually look kindly on his staff. So you're not looking after the majority by actually ripping the bosses off. And actually, the bosses do actually pay most of the taxes. 400,000 people who pay a third of all the income tax in Britain. So why wouldn't they get a similar tax benefit if they're being tax prudent and paying so much into the scheme? You know.
Well, yeah, no, and I'm a big fan of aspiration and wealth accumulation. So I'm largely with you on that, John. I'm interested to see in the fullness of time whether all these rumours about the flight of the millionaires out of this country proves to be meaningful and actually impactful or not. I don't know at the moment.
I moved out of the country in 2016 when I realised that the lunatics were running it after the Brexit vote, right? I now have a little business here of actually helping people move to Portugal. We had 76 inquiries last week, 76. Some from the States, some from Canada, less from Britain because Britain's getting poorer and they can't afford to move. But, you know, it's I think you're going to vote with your feet. I mean, I'm surprised there isn't an exit tax yet. That's the one they've missed so far, but they're going to do it.
Billy.
Right. Oh, hello. So I'll just go back to Henry's point, and I think you're right about the mass market. I mean, I'm very interested in what I call client segmentation. You've got, bread and butter Britain, middle Britain, fat cat. I've got so many inquiries from people with serious money about the IHT, and there's no clear consensus of what's going to happen, but I think there will be a lot more gifting and IHT planning with assets. But it's this Middle Britain cohort I'm particularly interested in, and I do wonder if the IHT on unused pensions is a bit overblown there, especially when you think that most people need 3 or 4 grand a month to live a certain lifestyle. Take in the state pension, you've got to find 30 grand a year somewhere. That's £1 million. So for a Middle Britain person, throughout their retirement, they're going to have to go through £1 million in capital. And where does that come from? Does it come from their ISAs? Does it come from their savings or their pension? So I think there's a very strong argument going forward for people to pay the income tax on the pension and take an income. So in some respects, the IHT on unused pensions might encourage people to use their pensions for the benefit, for the reason they were intended. So it's not all bad news.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. And I'm really interested to see how the work that the DWP is doing on default accumulation and also the FCA on the advice guidance boundary review and how those two intersect into facilitating mass market solutions that are better than the current largely absence of guidance, bit of information, bit of pension wise, but for many people still stops short of full financial advice, which currently only around 8% of the population enjoy. And where I think, our friend Kevin over at Guide, where I think businesses like that have a really interesting role to play in helping the big institutions, the pension schemes, the life companies, to roll out something more than information, but less than advice as a guided decumulation solution process. Go on then, Kevin. I've mentioned your name, so jump in.
Yeah, not to promote any of that, but I'll give you a bit of an anecdote of you talk about different ranges of people and so forth. My mum my mum's about sort of 70 or so. A lot of her friends are in their 60s. I see her and her friends quite often, and I was talking to some of her friends. They were asking me about their state pension. And they were asking about topping up for their state pension. And I said, if you paid me, would you pay me £20,000 a year? About 10 of them. Would you pay me £20,000 a year for £1,000? Sorry, £20,000 as a lump sum for £1,000 a year, fully inflated with all of the benefits of state pension, so forth. No takers, no hands at all. Would you pay me 10,000 for that? No takers, no hands at all. Would you pay me 5,000 for that? One person put their hand up out of the 10. So I'm just kind of giving you a bit of a sort of anecdote of that's how normal people think. I think around pensions, they like the money to be there in their hands and so forth, and they seriously disvalue, the value of what an income for life, inflation linked, or whatever else would be. And that's, I'm just kind of giving that anecdote because we talk about, the nuances of tax and what people will do and whatever else. But the overriding factor is a lot of normal people just like money in their pocket, I think, rather than, some kind of promise along those lines, even if it's like, it's obviously financially mad not to pay £5,000 when you're about 65 to get £1,000 a year fully inflated for the rest of your life. But that's just an anecdote, I would say.
Yeah, interesting. And I think that's illustrative of the scale, excuse me, of the scale of the challenge that we face. That and this is back to my point around the government articulating a vision, how this all intersects. We've done auto-enrollment, great, but people are not financially engaged or financially literate. They're saving a bit, but a lot of them aren't saving enough. And I know Emma Reynolds' review moves on to adequacy next, and that will be really interesting to watch how they define what they want to achieve with the workplace private pension savings system, whether they're going to do anything for the self-employed and so on. It's a huge challenge remaining with that. How they deal with the decline in home ownership. And Steve Webb, I noticed, was quoted this week highlighting the growth in mortgages running through post-retirement and the challenges that face. So you huge numbers of people now with mortgages running through into their 60s and beyond. There's some fundamental shifts going on there. None of this looks easy, but I've not heard from the government any sense of this is how we fit the pieces of the jigsaw together. This is how, to the earlier point that was made, we help the mass market, not the people like John who are worried about IHT or wealth taxes, but how we help the mass market make adequate provision for their retirement. And, we're giving you currently 11.5 grand a year, going up to 12 grand a year as a state pension if you've done your 35 years, which most people will have done, but you don't get that till your mid-late 60s, right? How do you build on that to build that income that Billy talked about, where you want maybe £30,000 a year to live a reasonably comfortable lifestyle? I don't see any of that fitting together yet at the moment. John, sorry, I use your name in vain then, so come back in.
I think there's a misconception here. I decided with my financial planning business when I sold the retail business to the Prudential years ago, and they didn't want the rich clients because they didn't have solutions for rich clients. And they allowed me to keep 120 clients and 600 million under management. So my little business actually only catered for sophisticated high net worths, right? There's an assumption here that people want the IHT benefit. They don't necessarily want that. They deal with pension schemes with significant money in there at the end of the life of the beneficiary. The money is taxed anyway. There's income tax on it. So why further taxes? Why do they justify further taxes? It's going to go down the family. The revenue are going to get the money. We accept that. But why actually put constraints on it that stop you investing that money in an entrepreneurial way? Now, I never really made much money out of being a financial advisor. I made the most money by investing in things that other people offered, and they were more entrepreneurial. We became experts in business expansion schemes, EIS, CDIS, and we've had fantastic outcomes from those things, and we've made money. We've made money that way. And so I think I want to kill this idea that IHT was the motivation. It wasn't. It's just part of the deal. It's an extra burden on the deal that we had. It's retrospective legislation. That's not democratic. It just plainly isn't. And I don't mind paying tax. And I prefer to pay tax in a country where I actually get value for money. I don't save much tax. We're going to get 45% tax on everything we've got anyway, so who cares? It's just a question of where you decide to now be a taxpayer.
So, and that's fair enough. I think Rachel Reeves's answer to that was, well, you know, we're hitting the people with the broader shoulders. We need the money. We've got big spending plans. We need to fix the foundations, rebuild the state, and a lot of the state doesn't work very well. So I have some sympathy with that. But, you know, we can't ask the little people to pay. In fact, we promised them we wouldn't make them pay. So it's the rich people we need to get to pay, and that's where we're at.
Absolutely. But in fact, you know, what benefit is Wetherspoons to the economy of the country, right? That's just recirculating money. You should be selling stuff outside. You should be building infrastructure. You know, when I was using my degree when I worked for Taylor Woodrow's research, right, we were building Hunterston, Hartlepool, Wilford reactors. They only had a 30-year design life. Why 30 years for something that's got a half-life of 10,000 years? You know, this is just ridiculous thinking.
Well, yes, no, I agree with that. I also
Henry put out a very good paper this week on the problems that Britain has. An exceptional paper which I've read, and it lays out there what we're doing wrong. We should be building houses. I've been asked recently to put the finance together for 160 houses in a central London location for a local authority. Do you know where it gets the problem? The creditworthiness of the local authority is in doubt, and therefore there is no market and nobody will lend them the money. So really, my question is, who's going to default first once we've run out of the generosity of friends or the foolishness of friends? So defaults are what worry me at the moment.
Interesting. Henry?
Yeah, interesting for the OBR this week has said that we can expect to wait till at least 2030 now for the 2017 AU reforms to take effect. If you don't believe me, have a look at David Robbins' Twitter feed where I got this snippet of information from. Isn't the question of adequacy now shifting from the way we save, which looks to be, to me, to remain pretty static, to the way we spend, which looks to me to be quite open to change, let's say, yeah?
What do you mean by that, Henry? What do you mean by the way we spend? Just unpack that a bit.
Well, I mean, at the moment, we spend our pensions in very strange ways. You look at the FCA's statistics on the way we decumulate, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. The money is decumulating in all kinds of different ways. There's no spending pattern, if you like, to pensions anymore. There is simply a drawdown pattern, which really is pretty random. Yeah, we can't make head and tails of it.
Just to be clear, are you talking about the withdrawal pattern or the actual cash spending pattern once the money's been withdrawn?
I'm talking about the withdrawal pattern, Tom. I mean, what people spend that money on is their business, not none of the government's. But how people spend their pension pots should be a matter of interest to the government, not least because if people run out of money or hoard their money, it creates some kind of economic dislocation for the nation as a whole. We are looking at trying to protect generation upon generation from becoming a burden on each other.
Sounds to me like you're trying to reverse the pension freedoms there, Henry.
Well, I think that the government don't take any responsibility for those pension freedoms. I mean, we've had several governments since 2014 who necessarily had to, but now we have a government that had no part in what happened in 2014.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
Might well take a different view on how pensions should be spent.
Yeah,
Maybe
and I think
yeah.
I'm not part of the working groups, but the default decumulation stuff the DWP is working on, I think that's where it takes us. Is to say to the trustees, right, guys, you're on the hook now for helping your members implement a sensible, coherent withdrawal strategy. And for now, at least, people still have the freedom to do what they like with the money. I think the bumpers on those lanes are going to get narrower as we go on. Kevin.
Yeah, I was just going to say, would you not expect a chaotic withdrawal pattern? I mean, essentially, I could understand if the only provision that people had was their DC pension pot, then you would expect a kind of pattern of some degree. But like for people, what they care about is their total income, and people will have various different types of total income. So with various different other parts of income and savings that they can use alongside the pension pot to give them the income that they want. So somebody withdrawing at 15% a year may seem madness, but it's not madness if they're 60 and they've got a chunky DB scheme kicking in at 65 and then their state pension a couple of years later. Somebody who's taken their lump sum and not touched their pension pot at all, like again, may seem a bit odd and not what you'd expect from a decumulation pattern, but it may be that they've continued in part-time work and that's giving them, what they need for now, and they don't expect to touch their other money till later. So I would expect kind of chaos and randomness in the overall withdrawal patterns of various people at the moment, especially whilst the cohort of people with DB benefits, previous DB benefits kind of go through. So yeah, so that's one thing. And then on the other thing, I was just going to mention as well, is that, we polled our users and 90% of people don't care if they have to reduce their income in kind of later years. And we're talking kind of 80 plus. I don't know, it's not the sensible thing, but people just don't care about it. If they have to withdraw, if they have to take less income in those years, they're kind of happy to say, well, I enjoy the income now, and if I'm poor in later life, fine. Obviously, when they get to that age, they probably won't think like that, but that's what they think like at 60 to 65, overwhelmingly, when we ask them.
Well, yeah, and my wife and I had that very conversation this weekend, and have just kind of booked ourselves a skiing holiday in Colorado. So, there's that. But I mean, to the chaos and randomness, I think that's fine as long as it has some purpose. And one of the things that worries me is, and one of the things I'm interested in around the advice guidance boundary review and the DWP default accumulation thing. And one of my annoyances about maps and going back to quangos and not want to go around in complete circles, but I'm beginning to question whether MAPS actually has a purpose at all. The whole pension-wise service has a purpose at all. I would much rather see those kind of services reverse back into the private sector. The kind of work that Guide do, that the big financial institutions want to be able to do to help people create a retirement income plan. I mean, half the challenge with retirement income is not the income, it's the spending. Is what does my pattern of consumption look like in retirement? I need to work through all of that before I can then match up an income plan to do that. There's no way pension-wise can do that, and I think there's some interesting opportunities in the marketplace for how that could be done. But at the moment, I think we're asking the wrong questions and all that. Anyway, Padraig.
You just touched on the point I was going to make. I mean, Henry talks about people spending their pensions in an odd way. We've been allowed to develop, our society's been allowed to develop, largely since Thatcher came in, to be fair, a very unhealthy attitude to money, in that we're now being not encouraged and almost compelled to save so we can service debt in our old age. And it's something's got to change, but none of the governments want to tackle it wholesale because it's such a big problem. And you're right, the great white elephant of Holborn has achieved nothing. If anything, it's damaged all the parts that it took under its wing. Sorry to mix my analogies there with animals, but
it's a flying elephant.
It's an absolute shit show.
It's not in Holborn anymore. It's gone.
No, I know, but that's what I called it when it was created, and I'm not going to change it now. I'm stuck in my ways. So.
But it is costing £160 million a year, and that's coming out of people's pension pots. Billy.
Well, following on from what Henry said and Kevin, the thing that I struggle with in all of this is that I actually speak to people on a daily basis about their income in retirement, and something really strange going on. When people are working, they go to the nth limit to make sure they get the highest salary and their bonuses and their expenses. But in retirement, very few people really plan, and they're seriously hemorrhaging money. And I've seen people take these random, amounts of money from their pension pots. And I think, Tom, if we could do people a favour, it's just give them the message that income in retirement is a really serious thing. And if they don't take steps to, maximise their income, that they are just throwing money down the drain, and they will regret it in later life.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I'm also quite annoyed. Sorry, John, I'll come to you in a second. I'm really annoyed about the dashboards getting kicked down the road. Yes, we're going to get the government dashboard. To me, it's critical that we get commercial dashboards. I'm not involved in any of the development of them, but if I were, I imagine there's people out there currently quite annoyed at the way the government's just put their business plans on hold. People have been spending money developing commercial dashboards, and to me, they're back to my point about maps. They're an essential part of the solution. The data should be exportable, which it won't be to start with. All these things need to be part of the ecosystem that helps to serve people as they approach retirement. John.
It's not just pensions that we need to be funding for. A lot of people finish up 10 years in retirement homes. It costs about $1,000 a week to be in a decent retirement home. You need about 90,000 a year of income to produce that, which means you need about 700,000 of capital to support that. So really, of your pension, partition some of that, that's 700,000, for when you're too old to look after yourself, because that happens to the majority of people. Most people don't finish up an account because they don't have 90,000 a year pool to draw on. So it's not just pensions, it's actually funding for long-term care.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, so I've been having lots of conversations with the equity release sector recently. I did a report on it a couple of years ago. I think a lot of people use the house as the backstop for that eventuality. But
we had a scheme years ago in the early 70s, 72, when I was working with a guy called John Woolnough at Sun Life. We're trying to find some novel solutions. And we came across lots of little old ladies in places like Worthing and Eastbourne who were actually had no dependents. The war had taken them out. So they were on their own. So they're now living in a palace which is falling down around their ears. And do you know who the beneficiary is there? The Crown. So we invented a very simple scheme to actually do, we take the house off the old lady and give her and buy an annuity, and the pension funds would buy the house. They would repair the house. They would bring it up to a standard. She could stay in the house and she'd get a lease for 30 years at £1 a year. And then the revenue stopped us doing that scheme because they said we're all going to put our grannies in our pension schemes, and that wasn't what they were trying to do. Everybody won on that scheme. And in fact, there are a lot of houses that actually could be recycled in that way. I mean, the Crown makes 51 million a year out of its land rights alone. So I'm sure it wouldn't miss the odd house, would it?
I'm conscious of time. Podrick's got his hand up. I don't know if that's a lingering hand or a new hand. So no, thank you. It's 11:29. So I just want to check, is there anyone who hasn't said something they particularly want to raise on the call at this point?
Tom, I think it's an absolutely fantastic session. We have so much more. You had the Mansion House speech, opposition, CDC, Tontine, schemes on a small pot. Can we do Tom McPhail in conversation in a couple of weeks' time, Tom? Because there's a massive agenda that is working really well. Only if you're free, Tom, obviously, but we'll maybe take that offline. But I know you're.
I'm always happy to do this. Whether anyone wants to come back for more is another question. But
I'm sure everybody will come back. Can we all give Tom a big clap, a virtual clap, an actual clap for a great session as usual, and fantastic. I think we will do Tom McPhail sort of 2, Paddington 2, Tom McPhail 2, or whatever. So we'll do that very, very shortly, because loads and loads more to talk about, Tom. There's been a great session. The video will be up later on today, and the podcast will be on later today. As usual, we pray for peace in the East, peace in the Middle East, which I know, Tom, you mentioned earlier as well. And we really appreciate everybody's input today. Lots of questions, lots and lots of good ideas, lots and lots of stuff to be done, Tom. I do think we need to continue this session again in a couple of weeks, definitely. And if you're up for it, I think a lot of our guests will join. So thank you, Tom. Really, really appreciate it. Next week we've got Margaret Snowden, in conversation with Margaret Snowden, who many of you will know, OBE. So maybe, Tom, we might be able to do you on the 26th or the 3rd, but we'll take diaries offline. But Tom, that was an absolutely fantastic session, and we tip of the iceberg, as they say. So, but great. Enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy the rest of your week. And fantastic session. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks,
All right,
guys.
take care. Cheers, Tom. Bye. Bye.
Cheers, Tom.